Oh, hello Internet! This is my next video on Hannah Arendt's Between Past and Future, and the second essay in the book is a weighty essay with a weighty title, The Concept of History. And there's already some additional meaning here. Historical materialism, birthed out of Hegel, developed into Marx, with all of the philosophical baggage that name implies. In the previous essay, we saw that Hannah Arendt explains why the baggage is somewhat undeserved, although she is far from a full-throated endorsement of Marx, as we shall see below. This is the territory then. What is the concept of history? Where did it originate? And what is the crucial difference between the ancient and the modern concept of history? And how does all of this relate to the crises of modernity? This essay is twice the length of most of the essays and divided into three distinctly overlapping parts, named by Arendt this time. The largest is part 1, History and Nature, and this details how humanity developed a concept of history and how it was always informed by our relationship to nature, and how it differed through time and the various inflection points from antiquity to the modern age. Part 2 is called History and Earthly Mortality, in which Arendt dismantles the connection between the modern concept of history and the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, and replaces it with an entirely new kind of earthly immortality derived from the secularization of the modern age. And Part 3, History and Politics, in which Arendt investigates the early modern focus on politics as the appropriate realm of action, and why this was eventually replaced by the modern secular concept of history to make up action's shortcomings. Of course, with Arendt, it always comes back to politics. Remember that she calls herself a political theorist rather than a philosopher, and this speaks to one thing that she genuinely does seem to admire Marx for, and that is his will, like Nietzsche, to somehow turn philosophy back to the world, to make it practical in some way. My general disclaimer, I'm not an academic, nor do I speak German or Greek. This is an amateur inquiry, and you can let me know below if there are any errors or misunderstandings as you see it. I do refer to some of the Greek terms that Arendt cites. I've transcribed them exactly as best I can, but I have only a rudimentary knowledge on pronunciation, so apologies there. I've referred to the site Lexilogos for definitions. And finally, since it will come up in the course of the essay, I will briefly introduce again here this schematic of the Vita Activa from The Crisis in Culture. This is my schematic based on what I understand of Arendt, so, you know, credit to Arendt, blame to me, etc., etc. This schematic is not going to be referred to through most of the essay, but it will come up later when I will give some more details. But for now, it will give some context on my perspective. Arendt starts by saying that Herodotus is the beginning of any possible thread of what might be called history. He, like Homer, acknowledged the need for impartiality as a concept. His purpose was to save from oblivion the great deeds of men, and it largely was males then, of course. This idea of making human deeds immortal by remembrance was something that was very natural to Herodotus, but it is less so to us. So this first section takes an exhaustive look at the ancient concept of history and its relation to nature. In the Greek perspective, nature is immortal. Those things that just are. Neither man nor gods are responsible for it. This immortality includes all animals, including humans, insofar as they are biological members of a cyclically propagating species. However, for the Greeks, humans are also the mortals. They are mortal by virtue of their individual lives with a beginning and end. All things in nature are either unchanging or cyclical. Human life is technically neither of these, and a human bios, a biographical life, is different from, but emerges somehow out of, a human zoon, a biological life. It is this rectilinear life and the events that comprise it that ancient history protected through remembrance. This individual life is distinguished by the rectilinear course of its movement, cutting through the circular movements of biological life. This is mortality, to move along a rectilinear line in a universe where everything, if it moves at all, moves in a cyclical order. To give it its due, mortality is what manifests itself in the world and gives birth to what is unpredictable, extraordinary, or great. This is the first rendering of how ancient history determines what is worthy of remembrance. Whenever men pursue their purposes, tilling the effortless earth, forcing the free-flowing wind into their sails, crossing the ever-rolling waves, they cut across a movement which is purposeless and turning within itself. It is interesting to see the metaphors chosen: tilling the earth, wind in the sails, representing the powers of humanity in the pre-modern age. But they still show how the mortal life takes action upon nature and thus disturbs the eternal quiet of being forever, the peace of a purely physical universe where nothing unexpected happens at all. This concept of acting into nature will be seen again later, but it is people who create the unexpected. Works, deeds, speech. These are the raw materials of anything that can rightfully be called history as something distinct from nature. All human acts can be lost over time unless energy is expended to recall them. Remembrance gives human greatness a form of immortality, rendering it in the tapestry of history. Over time, this is how culture forms, how tradition is constructed, and also how dogmas are born. Mortal deeds interrupt what would otherwise be simply an inertial process, but these deeds are not parts of a whole. The stress is always on the single instances, deeds or events that interrupt the circular movement of daily life, in the same sense that the rectilinear bios of the mortals interrupts the circular movement of biological life. The subject matter of history is these interruptions, the extraordinary, in other words. I have some difficulty conceptualizing Arendt's position here, which could be a me problem, of course. We mentioned that a human life represents a line with a beginning and an end. It is in this sense that the bios is said to be rectilinear. But if this is the case, then how does the bios cut through the circular movements of biological life? The best that I can make out is that the line or life does not cut across the cycle as such, but rather the whole represents the interruption. The biographical life of each individual is an unexpected event in the ongoing biological process. And on a smaller scale, the discrete actions of each individual are unexpected events within this life, and it is the complex sum of these events that is the world. But again, the meaning is composed of the individual things combined, and so is still originally rooted in the acts themselves. The field of the investigation changed in late antiquity, where something that might begin to be called a concept of history began to emerge, along with the idea of process. Around this time, it was assumed that any process of history must be cyclical, following the model of biological life. This new concept of history seemed suitable for creating a holistic sense of nature and the place of the human world within it, which was desirable to the philosopher, the analytic precursor of the scientist, but for the poet and the historiographer, if the whole of history was just another cyclical process, then it undermined the mechanism of remembrance to imbue human deeds with greatness by association with the immortal. To cover the difference very briefly, history is the record of the facts and events that form human chronology, and the way that these events propagate into each other through act and consequence is what is called the historical process. Historiography is the system of methods by which history is recorded and judged to be passed down to those that follow. The way that history is drawn, if you like. Historiography. Clearly, these concepts are complementary and will to some extent affect each other, but I'm not an expert on any of them. So Arendt says that early Western historiography assumed the distinction between the mortality of humans and the immortality of nature. As such, only what is born of mortals can be perishable. Arendt then uses this 1921 verse by Rilke to contrast that to the modern mind. In modernity, even the mountains degrade to nothing in time. But for Herodotus, it is not just all man-made things that constitute history, but specifically words, deeds, and events. And these are the most futile things of all. Human constructions can at least persist through time because they are constructed using the immortal raw material of nature, but actions, unless remembered, leave no trace at all after they occur. This is the Greek distinction between poiesis on the one hand, fabrication or creation, and the concepts of praxis and pragmata on the other. Praxis is the activity of free people, the application of a theory into practice. Pragmata is a little more nuanced because it can also refer to the objects themselves under certain circumstances. The task of the poet and the historiographer consists in making something lasting out of remembrance. They do this by translating praxis and lexis, action and speech, into that kind of poesis or fabrication which eventually becomes the written word. So the construction of both ancient poetry and history consists in taking the actions and words of people, which are ephemeral, and applying the skill of the craftsman to fabricate something that exists apart as an object in the world. Arendt has an anecdotal example from myth. History, as a category of human existence, poetically speaking, began in the moment when Ulysses, at the court of the king of the Phaeacians, listened to the story of his own deeds and sufferings, to the story of his life, now a thing outside himself, an object for all to see and to hear. In chapter 8 of the Odyssey, Ulysses is hosted by King Alcinous, and a bard recounts tales from the siege of Troy. Ulysses weeps at the painful memories, and this is the point that Arendt chooses to focus on. The scene where Ulysses listens to the story of his own life is paradigmatic for both history and poetry. The reconciliation with reality, the catharsis, which according to Aristotle was the essence of tragedy and according to Hegel was the ultimate purpose of history, came about through the tears of remembrance. The deepest human motive for history and poetry appears here in unparalleled purity, since listener, actor, and sufferer are the same person. All motives of sheer curiosity and lust for new information are naturally absent in Ulysses himself, who would have been bored rather than moved if history were only news and poetry only entertainment. Ulysses' life became an object, and he himself was, crucially, affected by it. Catharsis is a common concept in all of poetry and dramatic works, the moment at which the audience is able to perceive the events of the story as having meaning and thereby achieve the emotional release. This is part of what greatness is and how it is connected to meaning. Catharsis itself means purification or refinement, and its purpose in tragedy is to transmute the emotions of pity and fear so that we may continue to function in response to suffering and the causes of suffering. At least this was the belief of the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell. This is not only in the context of the story, catharsis carries over into our own everyday lives. This is why fiction can be such a powerful force, and why Hegel goes further to make this catharsis the ultimate purpose of history. But Arendt says that there is a great and painful paradox implied in these reflections. This paradox, that greatness was understood in terms of permanence, the being forever of nature, while human greatness was seen in precisely the most futile and least lasting activities of men, has haunted Greek poetry and historiography, as it has perturbed the quiet of the philosophers. Paradox here means apparently contradictory rather than actually logically contradictory, I think. Human greatness, then, was found in the words and deeds of great men, even more than in the records of the poets and historians that record them, even though those fabrications, by virtue of having a concrete existence, are technically a step closer to nature's permanence. This paradox has been emphasized repeatedly, and Arendt says that the early Greek solution consists in empowering poets to bestow immortal fame upon words and deeds. The change, prepared by Parmenides, came about with Socrates and reached its culmination in Plato, and he seems to have been the first who considered the desire to become famous and not lie in the end without a name on the same level as the natural desire for children through which nature secures the immortality of the species, though not the athanasia of the individual person. In his political philosophy, therefore, he proposed to substitute the latter for the former, as though the desire for immortality through fame could as well be fulfilled when men are immortal because they leave children's children behind them, and partake of immortality through the unity of a sempiternal becoming. He obviously hoped this would be sufficient for the common man's natural yearning for deathlessness. So am I passing that right? Plato put the urge for fame on the same level as the urge to procreate, and in his political philosophy then, he wanted to put the latter in place of the former. Plato wished to replace the need for remembrance with the need for progeny, and in this way, the common man achieves sufficient immortality to satisfy him without the need for any lasting record. Thus, the concept of immortal greatness becomes unnecessary, and I'm sure it is entirely coincidental that the Republic therefore has a consistent supply of fresh bodies. It seems then that, contrary to what we might expect, Plato wishes to place a biological process in place of a conceptual one, greatness. However, this is only for the common man. Neither Plato nor Aristotle any longer believed that mortal men could immortalize through great deeds and words. They had discovered, in the activity of thought itself, a hidden human capacity for turning away from the whole realm of human affairs, which should not be taken too seriously by men, because it was patently absurd to think that man is the highest being there is. This hidden human capacity is the vita contemplativa, the life lived in contemplation, the mode of being which philosophy has represented since Plato and all the way up to Marx. To quickly address the two Greek terms as best as I can, athanasia means immortality, but athanatizein seems to be a verb, immortalizing. However, the term is difficult to pin down, and it is not necessarily the activity of an individual person. Arendt notes that it was rarely used in the whole Greek corpus. Aristotle was the first and perhaps the last to use this word for the specifically philosophical activity of contemplation. There is probably other scholarly opinion on this Greek word, though, is what I'm saying. However, Arendt quotes the relevant section of the Nicomachean Ethics. One should not think as do those who recommend human things for those who are mortals, but rather one should immortalize as far as possible. If we compare this translation to several others, we can see that all of them render the concept based on some other verb, make, achieve, or be, with immortal as an adjective or noun in there. Arendt also mentions that the Latin translation eschews a perfectly good word, etinare, to immortalize, in favour of immortalem facere, to make immortal. I don't know how these translations are constructed and why, but Arendt takes the time to point this out, and obviously she considers it to be significant. Plato and Aristotle have therefore disregarded any form of athanatizein that depends on action itself, which would have been a prerequisite of Homeric greatness. For them, only the vita contemplativa could satisfy the philosophic need to transcend the world, and this activity is actionless and speechless, without praxis or lexis. The Aristotelian nous, the highest and most human capacity of pure vision, cannot translate into words what it beholds, and the ultimate truth which the vision of ideas disclosed to Plato is likewise an araton, something which cannot be caught in words. This was the post-Socratic solution to the paradox. The only immortal greatness was contemplation of the ideal realm, and hence could never be a part of the being forever of nature. Man could no longer actively compare or measure himself against the self-evident immortality and the greatness of the cosmos and the gods. But this solution clearly comes about at the expense of the doer of great deeds and the speaker of great words. Arendt concludes this first section of Part 1 with a summary paragraph of the Greek concept of history prior to the Platonic shift. The concern with greatness, so prominent in Greek poetry and historiography, is based on the most intimate connection between the concepts of nature and history. Their common denominator is immortality. Immortality is what nature possesses without effort and without anybody's assistance, and immortality is what the mortals therefore must try to achieve if they want to live up to the world into which they were born. The connection between history and nature is therefore by no means an opposition. History receives into its remembrance those mortals who, through deed and word, have proved themselves worthy of nature, and their everlasting fame means that they, despite their mortality, may remain in the company of the things that last forever. We now move on to the modern era, and Arendt claims that there is still a connection, albeit a different one, between history and nature. The 19th century opposition of the natural and historical sciences is today a thing of the past. The natural sciences now admit that with the experiment, testing natural processes under prescribed conditions, and with the observer, who in watching the experiment becomes one of its conditions, a subjective factor is introduced into the objective processes of nature. Arendt references Heisenberg, citing the same quote that we saw in the final essay on the conquest of space and the stature of man. The most important new result of nuclear physics was the possibility of applying quite different types of natural laws without contradiction to one and the same event. Within a system of laws which are based on certain fundamental ideas, only certain, quite definite ways of asking questions make sense, and thus such a system is separated from others which allow different questions to be put. An experiment is a question put to nature, and so any experiment and the data it provides is necessarily posed in the subjectivity of the questioner, the scientist. And so Arendt says, physics, we know today, is no less a man-centered inquiry into what is than historical research. Despite this Heisenbergian take, I can imagine that many physicists bristle at this claim. Arendt will make it several times as we proceed, this idea that natural science has somehow been robbed of its true objectivity, and I myself do have some sympathy for this perspective. I will take it at face value for the purposes of the present discussion, but we will come full circle on this. It is a strong claim, but it is useful for comparison with a different problem. The problem of objectivity in the historical sciences is the extinction of self as the condition of pure vision, i.e., abstention from bestowing either praise or blame, together with an attitude of perfect distance when following documentary sources. The only limitation of this attitude, which Droysen once denounced as eunuchic objectivity, lay in the necessity of selecting material from a mass of facts which, compared with the limited human capacities, appeared infinite. Let's just appreciate the term eunuchic objectivity for a moment. Sadly, I have not the time or ability to chase down the full context from the original German, but considering Arendt's usage, it does seem to imply a certain loss of potency that comes from the restrictions of historical objectivity. As amusing as the term is, there is a reason why historians strive to achieve both non-interference and non-discrimination. And Arendt says that overall, the latter is far harder to achieve because there is always some kind of bias in any selection of sources in the construction of a historical narrative from the many smaller narratives that are bound to exist. In fact, Arendt says that it is a problem that this new science of history is conforming itself to the old standards of scientific objectivity, the very ones that Heisenberg tells us to question. The experiences that heralded this loss of objectivity come from the early modern era, such as Galileo examining the cosmos, or early chemists like the Lavoisiers uncovering a new understanding of matter. These were harbingers of the loss of scientific objectivity because they demonstrated that humans could not form a coherent, common sense model of the world because human sense data alone was not sufficient to explain the world. The modern historical sciences harked back to the scientific and, in the last analysis, philosophical attitude which the modern age had just begun to liquidate. The extinction of the self had its roots in Aristotelian and medieval natural science, which consisted mainly in observing and cataloguing observed facts. Historical objectivity thus uses the Aristotelian model of investigation, which favoured the contemplative, actionless, speechless mode. Prior to the modern age, this model would also have been the proper attitude of the scientist. In the modern age, however, Aristotelian objectivity had lost its grounding, so historical science could only maintain it by giving history as a whole some kind of meaning, either as a cyclical phenomenon or in the execution of some divine plan with a beginning and an end. This would allow the Aristotelian model to function because it would allow us to look back on history in a coherent way. Both these concepts, however, were actually quite alien to the new consciousness of history in the modern age. They were only the old traditional framework into which the new experiences were pressed and from which the new science had risen. The real issue at stake, the issue of impartiality, which is indeed decisive, has become difficult to recognize. The new science of history, by relying on old models of scientific progress, has, a la Heisenberg, constrained its own development by the assumptions that it makes and therefore the questions it is able to pose. Because of this, Arendt says that impartiality has been lost, and so, of course, she returns to Homer as the progenitor of the concept. Homeric impartiality is, she says, still the highest form of objectivity we know, a bold claim which I will not examine. This impartiality is presented in 3 parts, although only the first 2 are attributed to Homer himself. These 3 parts are, in essence, 1. Present all facts equally, 2. Recognize no winners, and 3. Observe contrasting opinions. Of course, this model is based on the ancient concept of history, namely, that which is worthy to be spoken of and immortalized. The first aspect is to report facts irrespective of allegiance, to praise the glory of Hector no less than the greatness of Achilles. Arendt claims that in later times, including our own, it is far more common to take the partisan approach and to consider that this is entirely proper. The second aspect, similarly, is to ignore any sense of winners and losers. Modern analysis often regards winners or losers as the ultimate determination of value in history, whereas the ancients felt that this was irrelevant in assigning immortalizing praise. The final aspect was not Homer's, but appears several centuries later. It could come to the foreground only after long experience in polis life, which consisted largely of citizens talking with one another. The Greeks discovered that the world we have in common is usually regarded from an infinite number of different standpoints, to which correspond the most diverse points of view. The Greek learned to exchange his own viewpoint with those of his fellow citizens. This was his own opinion, the way it appeared and opened up to him. Doke moi, it appears to me, from which comes doxa, or opinion. This is an early form of Kant's enlarged mentality, which Arendt refers to repeatedly, the ability of people in a polis to enhance their political judgment by seeing that the tapestry of human experience is always far richer than the singular perspective, and this could come about only once the polis was old enough for this awareness to germinate. Arendt says that this Homeric impartiality has been lost in the modern age because modernity has forgotten or abandoned the Greek idea of greatness. This greatness, as we saw earlier, was supposed to be self-evident. But how exactly? How do we judge which things are worthy of immortalizing praise? Greatness was easily recognizable as that which by itself aspired to immortality, as a heroic contempt for all that merely comes and passes away, for all individual life, one's own included. This is a sobering perspective. By including the final proviso, one's own included, we can see that this greatness is more than just a callous disregard for life, although it could manifest as such. But to modern ears, it still sounds off somehow. But why would that be? Jesus! This sense of greatness could not possibly survive intact into the Christian era, because, according to Christian teachings, the relationship between life and the world is the exact opposite to Greek and Latin antiquity. It is the world that will pass away. Men will live forever. The Christian reversal is based upon the altogether different teachings of the Hebrews, who always held that life itself is sacred, more sacred than anything else in the world, and that man is the supreme being upon earth. This Judeo-Christian exaltation of the life and or soul led to the rejection of Greek greatness, which has remained even as the belief in the Judeo-Christian system has faded. The essential focus on self-interest has also remained as one of the roots of Western individualism. It means, however, that Homeric impartiality has no place in modern Western political life. We have no room left for an activity based on contempt for one's own life interest. Selflessness may still be a religious or a moral virtue. It can hardly be a political one. Objectivity lost its validity in experience, was divorced from real life, and became that lifeless academic affair which Droysen rightly denounced as eunuchic. The ancient and modern concepts of history are beginning to be drawn apart now, and if you watched my previous video on tradition and the modern age, we're also beginning to see why Arendt says Nietzsche was mistaken in trying to just reinstate the Greek concept of greatness out of whole cloth. But there's more. The modern idea of history both coincided with and was driven by the modern age's doubt of the reality of an outer world objectively given to human perception. The most important consequence of this doubt was the emphasis on sensation as more real than the sensed object, and the only safe ground of experience. Against this subjectivization, which is part of the still growing world alienation of man, all judgments ended at the level of the lowest of all sensations, the sensation of taste. This conviction, the vulgarity of its defenders on the theoretical level notwithstanding, has disturbed the conscience of the historian much more deeply because it has much deeper roots in the general spirit of the modern age than the allegedly superior scientific standards of his colleagues in the natural sciences. Arendt is throwing a bit of shade everywhere there, but I'll try and summarise. The shift into the modern age was accompanied by the undermining of belief in a correlation between our sense perceptions and any kind of real world underlying them. Sensation coming to be regarded as the only thing that we can really claim to know. And it was this subjectivization that was part of world alienation and was also how all objective judgments were reduced to matters of taste, the lowest of all sensations. Why taste is the lowest of all sensations is not entirely clear, but I would guess it is because of its association with the gustatory process which sustains life on a biological level. This reduction was disturbing to the historian more so than the scientist because it pertains directly to the human spirit of the modern age, which is a product of the humanities, and which Arendt discusses more in the final essay on the stature of man. I think that's what she was saying just then anyway. The final sentence also makes reference to Marx and his followers and is a little bit blunt. Earlier in the paragraph, she co-opts the idea of alienation, although she does mean something a little different to it than Marx. Marx never had access to Heisenberg after all. However, she now says that the followers of such reductive new convictions are vulgar, and to be fair, this is still restrained compared to how some people react to old Beardy. It is unusual for Arendt, however. This vulgarity is, I think, to be found in the postmodern tendency to be somewhat unreflective in rejecting things from the past. She does not linger on it, however, and although she is a touch more diplomatic, I think we can hear her ascribe some of the blame to the traditional academics. Unfortunately, it is in the nature of academic quarrels that methodological problems are likely to overshadow more fundamental issues. World alienation is one of the outcomes of the great advances of the natural sciences of the 16th and 17th century, but it is hard to perceive as a pervasive part of our modern lives, because out of it, and partly at least out of its despair, did arise the tremendous structure of the human artifice we inhabit today, in whose framework we have even discovered the means of destroying it altogether with all non-man-made things upon the earth. World alienation is the fundamental issue. It is here, and yet it also brought us here through the loss of the senses which, ironically, heralded modern science. The quarrels that emerge between different structures are the methodological problems that Arendt speaks of. These differences have been allowed to take over the field of debate so comprehensively that the world alienation is something that we almost never discuss anymore. So where did it come from? The shortest and most fundamental expression this world alienation ever found is contained in Descartes' famous De omnibus dubitandum est. For this rule signifies something altogether different from the skepticism inherent in the self-doubt of all true thought. Descartes came to this rule because the then recent discoveries in the natural sciences had convinced him that man in his search for truth and knowledge can trust neither the given evidence of the senses, nor the innate truth of the mind, nor the inner light of reason. Descartes' faith in sensation was destroyed by the Copernican revolution, the first modern revelation of a truth so manifestly at odds with direct sense experience that it showed sensation itself to be fundamentally flawed to even establish truth. This was the source of the skepticism that has blossomed into the modern age. But there is a priority error, according to Arendt, in our common conceptions. The loss of certainty is often attributed to either the loss of faith in God or the loss of faith in reason itself. But in fact, both of those problems were born out of the loss of confidence in the truth-revealing power of the senses. None of the traditional metaphors for suprasensual truth, be it the eyes of the mind which can see the sky of ideas, or the voice of conscience listened to by the human heart, can any longer carry its meaning. The loss of confidence in the senses is the ultimate source of world alienation and is explanatorily prior to the loss of faith in God or reason. This led the scientists to put their faith in the experiment with spectacular results. By interfering with nature on the assumption that direct sensation was unreliable, modern science was liberated to make seemingly limitless discoveries. But there are two serious implications. First, experiment is a form of action. And this is what leads ultimately to the overturning of the Platonic and Aristotelian domination of philosophy with its actionless and speechless contemplation. The second implication is that, in spite of the discoveries it enabled, world alienation would ultimately turn on us in the end when the advances of science took us not only beyond perception, but beyond conception. The indissoluble connection between our thinking and our sense perception takes its revenge, for a model that would leave sense experience altogether out of account and therefore be completely adequate to nature in the experiment is not only practically inaccessible, but not even thinkable. If you insist that the data of the experiment supersedes sense data, what do you do when it turns out that sensation was fundamental to your thought process in the first place? But scientists hold themselves in abeyance. Arendt is not really here to beat on you. She is focused on the impact of this radical subjectivization in the political arena. One of the first to try and bring this idea of experiment, and thus action, into political thought was Hobbes. We see in his Leviathan the attempt to create a system of definitions for the human world that somehow matched the precision of recent scientific discoveries. However, of much more immediate consequence for our concept of history was the positive version of subjectivism, which arose from the scientific revolutions. Although it seems that man is unable to recognize the given world which he has not made himself, he nevertheless must be capable of knowing at least what he made himself. This is why Vico turned his attention to history and thus became one of the fathers of modern historical consciousness. He said, "Mathematical matters we can prove because we ourselves make them. To prove the physical, we would need to make it." Giambattista Vico is an 18th century philosopher and historian commonly credited as one of the first social scientists and instigator of the field of philosophy of history. He turned to history because humans may only know historical truth as far as he saw it. Physical truth was reserved for God. This fact led Vico and others during the 17th and 18th centuries to shift the emphasis of their investigations from the what to the how. And Arendt observes this makes perfect sense if one assumes that man can know only what he has made himself. Thus, science shifted from a focus on things to a focus on processes. And this change to a process-based concept of history was absolutely decisive. Since the 17th century, the chief preoccupation of all scientific inquiry, natural as well as historical, has been with processes. But only modern technology, substituting mechanical processes for human activities, and eventually even starting new natural processes, would have been wholly adequate to Vico's ideal of knowledge. Modern technology, more so than the theoretical sciences that enabled it, showed that human action was indeed capable of starting new natural processes, demonstrating that mastery of nature which Vico thought was impossible. This again refers us to the final essay. Only practical execution of our new powers over nature demonstrate that our command of nature has grown, that is to say, our stature has increased. This concept of acting into nature is the true power of the scientist in the modern world, but as we saw, it does not give them power of determination over the stature of man itself. Process also affected the historical sciences. History emerged as something it had never been before. It was no longer composed of single events and individuals. It became a man-made process, the only all-comprehending process which owed its existence exclusively to the human race. And furthermore, this historical process has become unified with nature itself. We know today that we are quite capable of starting new natural processes, and that in a sense we therefore make nature to the extent that we make history. Arendt does say that this stage was reached only in the nuclear age, with even the early industrial technologies imitating natural forces rather than creating them. I'm not sure that this is a true bright line. Various critical technologies have created radical changes before. However, I think it is fair to say that this was the first radical advancement of technology to occur since the focus on process, and perhaps it is here that the difference lies. But for those who think that Arendt may be sliding towards a Marxian way of thinking, she has some strong words to follow, although they can be quite hard to pass. Since the beginning of the 20th century, technology has been the meeting ground of the natural and historical sciences, and the comparatively new social sciences, which so quickly became to history what technology had been to physics, may use the experiment in a much cruder and less reliable way than do the natural sciences, but the method is the same. They too prescribe conditions to human behavior, as modern physics prescribes conditions to natural processes. If their vocabulary is repulsive, and their hope to close the alleged gap between our scientific mastery of nature and our deplored impotence to manage human affairs through an engineering science of human relations sounds frightening, it is only because they have decided to treat man as an entirely natural being whose life process can be handled the same way as all other processes. Take note, conservatives. Arendt was critiquing wokeism decades before it was even a thing, and with far greater erudition than anything I tend to see these days. What is repulsive about their vocabulary exactly? What is frightening about the hope to treat human affairs more scientifically? These are rhetorical questions for Arendt. It is because they have decided to treat man as an entirely natural being whose life process can be handled in the same way as all other processes. Of course, I can see how this is an uncomfortable state of affairs. Taken to its extreme, this leads to the warning with which Arendt closes the book. If they should ever reach it in earnest, the stature of man would not simply be lowered by all the standards we know of, but have been destroyed. Speaking for myself now, I do take this threat seriously, the possibility of an unrestrained subjectivity in the social sciences eventually undermining social systems somehow. However, I do not reflexively reject all that the social sciences are trying to do, and furthermore, these techniques can be used on both sides of the culture war, you know. So that is my perspective, but I don't think Arendt sees the social sciences as the ultimate villain here either. If we strip down the last sentence of the critique above, it essentially says if their speech is R and their goals are F, it's only because their method is M. This is not a condemnation as such, but an attempt to understand. It is important to be aware how decisively the technological world we live in differs from the mechanized world as it arose with the Industrial Revolution. The difference corresponds essentially to the difference between action and fabrication. Arendt reinforces the idea that modern technology is somehow unique in its relation to action, while industrial processes simply improved our ability to manufacture objects for the human world out of the material of nature. The technological age is defined by man acting into nature then, and directing it into human artifice. Fabrication is distinguished from action in that it has a definite beginning and it comes to an end with its end product, which not only outlasts the activity of fabrication, but from then on has a kind of life of its own. Action, on the contrary, is utterly futile. It never leaves an end product behind. But Arendt does concede that even fabrications, once made, enter into the human world to become part of the historical process, and this makes their creation an action per se, the outcome of which can never be known to its author. As such, man is never exclusively homo faber. Even the fabricator begins processes. I thought that I would expand on this somehow with some 21st century examples. This was not strictly necessary, but I hoped it would elucidate the relationship that Arendt draws between fabrication and action, and make it more vital to the 21st century viewer. However, it quickly became clear that this would either be a massive detour or a dangerous oversimplification. So let me simply say this. Every acting person today has an idea on what humans acting into nature means, and therein lies some of our most contentious cultural issues. And doesn't that fact alone demonstrate that Arendt was onto something here? The dangers of this acting into nature are obvious if we assume that the aforementioned characteristics of human action, e.g. futility, ephemerality, and unpredictability, are part and parcel of the human condition. In which case, unpredictability is not a lack of foresight, and no management of human affairs will ever be able to eliminate it. The very qualities of action that we have discussed are what makes humans acting into nature so dangerous in the modern age. But attempting to remove unpredictability from action would be to discard the very essence of humanity itself. It is here that the Marxists come undone in Arendt's view. If the goal is to treat man as an entirely natural being and handle his processes in the same way as all other processes, then they are committed to treating human life processes in the same way as other scientific processes, and science abhors unpredictability. Therefore, only total conditioning, that is, total abolition of action, can ever hope to cope with unpredictability. And we have thus taken a hard turn from technology into politics here. Even the predictability of human behaviour, which political terror can enforce for relatively long periods of time, is hardly able to change the very essence of human affairs once and for all. It can never be sure of its own future. Given Arendt's studies on totalitarianism and how it fails, we can suppose she would not simply assume that this could only come from the excesses of postmodern social sciences. It could also come from a tradition believing itself to be sacrosanct that has gone out of control. But for Arendt, any system which continues to respect any concept of history and its connection with nature will have to take the unpredictable plurality, dare I say diversity, of humanity into account. Human action, like all strictly political phenomena, is bound up with human plurality, which is one of the fundamental conditions of human life insofar as it rests on the fact of natality, through which the human world is constantly invaded by strangers, newcomers whose actions and reactions cannot be foreseen by those who are already there. So no matter who or what the oppressor is, it turns out that no mere ideology can ever solve or suppress human nature as long as natality constantly pours novelty into the human world, an endless source of unpredictability. Neither history nor science are as potent as the plurality of our species, and to act into nature is to carry that unpredictability into a space that we thought was ruled by law. The iron law of history was always only a metaphor borrowed from nature, and this metaphor no longer convinces us because natural sciences can by no means be sure of an unchallengeable rule of law in nature as soon as men, scientists and technicians, or simply builders of the human artifice decide to interfere and no longer leave nature to herself. It is the arguably regrettable fact of human artifice that no scientist, including social scientists, will ever be able to construct a system that comprehensively includes themselves. Arendt says explicitly that technology is the ground on which history and nature meet in the modern age, and the signpost that indicates the connection between them. The new focus on process has become an endemic part of many different disciplines, and many different processes have created all kinds of different technologies. However, over time, these disciplines have drifted apart, and their processes have taken them to different places from each other, giving rise to the methodological quarrels between many aspects of the human world, but most notably between the historical and natural sciences. Process underpins the modern relationship between history and nature as immortality underpinned the ancient one. Another slightly more Eastern way of putting this is that we have seen a shift from nouns, those things that may be defined and referred to verbs, occurrences, and links between causes and effects. Western philosophy has really only come to this point in the 20th century, and the baggage that it carries has led to the dangerous situation that Arendt describes. And on top of that, even if process is the unifying principle of modern history and nature, this does not necessarily provide us with a satisfying grounding to build from. The experience which underlies the modern age's notion of process is not an experience which man made in the world surrounding him. On the contrary, it sprang from the despair of ever experiencing and knowing adequately what is given to man and not made by him. Process does not denote an objective quality of either history or nature. It is the inevitable result of human action. The first result of men's acting into history is that history becomes a process, and the most cogent argument for men's acting into nature in the guise of scientific inquiry is that today, in Whitehead's formulation, nature is a process. Where the ancients actively bestowed immortalizing praise and knew where it was warranted, modern humans are unable to actively say what it is that makes process so important to our concept of history. It is the very loss of certainty at all which has led to the notion of process in the first place. Contemplation cannot decode history, fabrication cannot complete history, labour cannot sustain history. Now, action has come to primacy, which we can exert even in the absence of certainty, to invoke natality, to begin something new. This does not mean that those other aspects have disappeared or that they have become irrelevant, of course, but only that action has become a kind of linchpin, and Arendt says that it is dangerous to ignore this fact. The world changes and humans interpret themselves differently through time. Classical antiquity used a twofold Aristotelian definition of a creature of polity and of speech. Roman and medieval periods used the definition of the animal rationale, the thinking animal, and the early modern period identified us as Homo faber, the constructing man. And then finally the 19th century came to see us as animal laborans, the labouring animal, where labour is taken in the Marxian aspect of the metabolism between humanity and nature. Against the background of these schematic definitions, it would be adequate for the world we have come to live in to define man as a being capable of action, for this capacity seems to have become the centre of all other human capabilities. We have thus reached the end of part 1 of the essay, and so we are almost halfway there. As I said at the outset, these 3 parts are overlapping, and so what we have seen so far will come up again. Arendt finishes with a sobering warning for us. It is beyond doubt that the capacity to act is the most dangerous of all human abilities, and it is also beyond doubt that the self-created risks mankind faces today have never been faced before. Considerations like these are not at all meant to offer solutions or to give advice. At best, they might encourage sustained and closer reflection on the nature of the intrinsic potentialities of action, which never before has revealed its greatness and its dangers so openly. Arendt is at least honest that she has no solution, but I suppose first we must create the conditions for such changes to occur. Also, she makes a clear link between greatness and action in the modern sense. I have one major conceptual question at this stage, but there will probably be an answer somewhere in Arendt's body of work. So, stupid question incoming. This essay was written around the same time as her most celebrated work, The Human Condition, and in that book she posits her 3 levels of the vita activa: labour, work and action. And she writes of the victory of animal laborans. But here, Arendt talks of the human capacity for action coming to dominate all others. I think the victory of animal laborans was supposed to be over Homo faber specifically, but how can Arendt claim this victory and the dominance of action simultaneously? The implication seems to be that in a technological world, we cannot escape action, ever, even in labour. We are all constantly presented with the irreversibility and unpredictability of our every deed. And although Arendt cheekily highlights the later generations as the new invaders, in reality we are all constantly agents of the historical process. If true, then it's easy to see how the victory of animal laborans carries with it a danger, and yet does somehow seem preferable to Homo faber. Animal laborans is connected to the earth, is vital in some basic way that still seems fundamentally human. That is why people have come to question the ivory towers of academia, which is technically the realm of action, but is always gatekept by the realm of work, and Homo faber deals with finished constructs, which are antithetical to action. However, if action is unceasing throughout the population, then an undirected mass of humanity will be a Brownian motion of interactions which would ultimately dismantle any structures that might be built over time. To decide that the realm of action has any meaning to give direction, then we need something to connect it to the realm of labour, something that ties back? Without such a thing, it is not surprising that Hannah Arendt took a relatively dim view of the modern world, and why she ultimately sides against Marx and refers to his disciples as vulgar in their meaninglessness. But her slightly more diplomatic talk of academic quarrels seems directed at some of the traditional thinkers' absolutely hysterical reaction towards anything to do with Old Beardy, based on a historical trauma which, though real, is not the proper context for this discussion. Part 2 is divided by paragraph breaks into 3 sections, but these are also overlapping in content. Section 1 will deal with Christianity and immortality, Section 2 with the rise of the secular, and Section 3 with the final link between process and immortality in the modern age. And, of course, we will mention antiquity repeatedly. We will begin with a sentence that summarises the impact of Part 1. The modern concept of process pervading history and nature alike separates the modern age from the past more profoundly than any other single idea. In the modern world, no thing has inherent meaning, not history, not nature, and not any individual occurrence within them. But Arendt says prior terms like disenchantment of the world or even alienation of man romanticize the past in different ways, creating a biased perspective. So what is the actual crux of it? What the concept of process implies is that the concrete and the general, the single thing or event and the universal meaning have parted company. The process, which alone makes meaningful whatever it happens to carry along, has thus acquired a monopoly of universality and significance. Individual things used to have inherent meaning, or so we thought, but now they are only given meaning by the wider process. This is different from any of the ancient concepts. Whether Greek poetry and historiography saw the meaning of the event in some surpassing greatness, justifying its remembrance, or whether the Romans conceived of history as a storehouse of examples taken from actual political behaviour demonstrating what the past had accumulated for the benefit of the present, modern historical process overruled both concepts, bestowing upon mere time sequence an importance and dignity it never had before. In short, in antiquity, entities and events gave meaning to the process, or constituted that meaning. In modernity, the reverse has started to be the case. But Arendt brings this up specifically because this is the dichotomy we are faced with, the reason that the past needs to be re-evaluated at all. Let us call it the Heisenberg-Arendt dichotomy, the problem of resolving a world in which humanity has conquered nature with a world in which that very conquest destroys the meaning of its own project. The dichotomy underpins the contrast between the ancient historical consciousness and its modern equivalent. We need to know how the one came to be the other, and what the significance of immortality is. At least, I think that's what the meaning of this heading is. Because of this modern emphasis upon time and time sequence, it has often been maintained that the origin of our historical consciousness lies in the Hebrew Christian tradition, with its rectilinear time concept and its idea of divine providence giving to the whole of man's historical time the unity of a plan of salvation. Which is why we always have to be living in the fucking end times. This idea of unity and providence stands as much in contrast to the insistence on individual events and occurrences of classical antiquity as to the cyclical time speculations of late antiquity. So that's it, right? Hebrew Christian tradition conceptualized time to transition the ancient form of history into the modern one. Anyway, there are three overlapping reasons why this Judeo-Christian comparison was made. First, the rectilinear notion of a time stream separated it from nature in the rejection of a cyclical model. Second, the providence of a plan or pattern, which would be the facsimile of a process. And third, the devaluing of individual events, which under Plato and Christianity were degraded as mere experience. Arendt lays out this prevailing argument that Augustine laid down the foundations of this single, predictable, rectilinear process, and these theological foundations went on to be secularized into the modern age. But Arendt is not convinced. Augustine's context was the fall of Rome, which many people claimed at the time was a decisive historical event. Augustine was disputing this when he wrote, because it undermined the uniqueness of Christ's coming on earth. Arendt counters the link between modern history and Christianity by pointing out that Augustine was only concerned with protecting the theological uniqueness of that one event. He was perfectly happy with the secular uniqueness of secular events. In the end, Augustine has countered the cyclical models of late antiquity, but he has not denied that secular events can be meaningful in much the same way as the Romans, i.e. as examples that may be referred to when repetitions occur. And so, says Arendt, Augustine's Christian interpretation of history matches up with the Roman model, but not with the modern concept of history. See above and below. Meanwhile, the Greeks, of course, stand apart with a subtly different concept of greatness. The difference between the faithful following of a recognized example and the attempt to measure oneself against it is the difference between the Roman Christian morality and what has been called the Greek agonal spirit, which did not know any moral considerations, but only an aristeuon, an unceasing effort to always be the best of all. First up, agonal is a perfectly normal adjective which I'm sure that you all use all the time. It means related to or characteristic of agony or the act of dying. Fun stuff. So, what is this agonal spirit and why is it related to the need to be the best of all? The answer to that question is the result of human millennia of work by many competent scholars. But if you want a philosophical hot take, this too shall pass. Not Greek. We can only measure ourselves against the ruler of history while we're actually here, and that is why immortalizing praise is something to be striven for in the first place. 34 words. Second, the Greek term aristeuon is from the Iliad, and it's translated as ever to excel. And this ruler of history is what differentiates the Greek from the Roman Christian aspects. The root term aristos, best, is part of our modern word aristocracy, best power, and this is part of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, which led him to the will to power. I'll leave that for you to explore, but for whatever my opinion is worth, one reason why Nietzsche is still so much maligned today is that both his critics and his supporters still treat the will to power in the context of the Roman Christian tradition rather than the Greek spirit that Nietzsche himself favoured, even though, as Arendt points out, this had flaws of its own. In contrast to that Greek spirit of striving, the Romans and the Christians had a tradition or a morality, a set of recognised truths that indicate a proper way of acting, whether it was the storehouse of traditional examples or explicit doctrine derived from scripture. With all of that said, all of these approaches are categorically different from the modern concept of history because, for us, on the other hand, history stands and falls on the assumption that the process in its very secularity tells a story of its own and that, strictly speaking, repetitions cannot occur. It is one single process that we are a part of. The strict uniqueness of the whole is responsible for the strict uniqueness of every individual part. Even if there is some value in recording previous events and maxims, there will always be an evolution of the system. You cannot step into the same river twice, which admittedly is Greek. Side note, but even though the Greeks did not have this all-encompassing idea of process, it is notable how Greek philosophy has remained kind of timeless and has sometimes been claimed to fit better with current year than the expansive edifice of tradition upon which current year rests. But I say the same for some Asian philosophy too, and not everyone would say this. But Arendt has not finished dismantling ideas of Christian modernity. Even more alien to the modern concept of history is the Christian notion that mankind has a beginning and an end, that the world was created in time and will ultimately perish like all things temporal. Christian concepts of the world, and thus history, depend on the idea that the world has a beginning and an end, and even though Christian chronology marked a foundation date at 0 AD, this was only similar to the Roman and many Eastern empires. In stark contrast stands the modern computation of historical dates, introduced only at the end of the 18th century, that takes the birth of Christ, sometimes also called 0 CE, as a turning point from which to count time both backward and forward. This was presented as a mere technical improvement, or to Hegel, the fixing of a Christian anchor in history. Neither of these explanations is satisfactory. Arendt points out that there have been lots of technical improvements through time, and the birth of Christ had been a special moment in history for centuries already. The real difference of the modern concept of history is that the history of mankind reaches back into an infinite past to which we can add at will, and into which we can inquire further as it stretches ahead into an infinite future. This twofold infinity of past and future eliminates all notions of beginning and end. Nothing could be more alien to Christian thought than this concept of an earthly immortality of mankind. And at least now we understand the title of this section. The modern idea of immortality is born out of the process, and perhaps it distills in its purest form to the famous declaration of Carl Sagan and his protege Neil deGrasse Tyson. We are star stuff, the enriched remains of stars subjected to endless processes, and that is all the immortality that we have in the modern sense. We should, of course, in mentioning this, nod to the concept of the Big Bang, which is still not properly defined and does, in principle, represent some kind of beginning. This could complicate Arendt's position, but it is not our concern here. So now we have a modern concept of earthly immortality, which became part of a historical consciousness around the end of the 18th century, ending in Hegel, who made all of metaphysics into history. Whatever the aspect, this shift of focus onto history as a holistic process was completely alien to all previous conceptions of Western metaphysics. The central concept of Hegelian metaphysics is history, in contrast to all previous metaphysics which, since Plato, had looked for truth and revelation everywhere except in the realm of human affairs, of which Plato speaks with such contempt precisely because no permanence could be found in it, and therefore it could not be expected to disclose truth. It must be said, though, not all modern humanities are strictly Hegelian, but they can sometimes take a similar perspective, divorcing from any traditional concept of history and actively encouraging humans to re-evaluate any or all sources in the search of some ultimate truth in the process itself. Men now began to read to force from history the ultimate truth it could offer to God-seeking people. But this ultimate truth was no longer supposed to reside in a single book. History itself was considered such a book, the book of the human soul in times and nations, as Herder defined it. To force from history calls back to the Greek concept of acting into nature, by making something out of its immortal material. The term God-seeking has replaced God-fearing because irrevocable divine hiddenness is a factual condition of modernity. Come at me. Not only that, but Arendt wants to suggest an extension of modernity itself in the name of establishing unbroken continuity. Recent historical research has shed much new light on the transitional period, with the result that the modern age has been traced back into the very heart of the Middle Ages. Arendt does not expand on this, and I have not covered the literature, so I'll take it at face value for now. This idea retroactively observes the emergence of the process and an unbroken historical continuity through earlier periods of time and into the modern age. This greater insistence on an unbroken continuity, valuable though it is, has one drawback: that by trying to bridge the gulf separating a religious culture from the secular world we live in, it bypasses rather than solves the great riddle of the sudden rise of the secular. Arendt agrees that the modern world is indeed a secular world. Historical consciousness must be connected to that, and therefore, by extension, to the loss of the transcendent realm also. But she rejects the idea that the old theological categories have evolved into new secular categories. Now, I can't comment substantively on anything that Arendt says about late 18th century historians, but whoever they are, Arendt says they are wrong. Secularization means, first of all, simply separation of religion and politics, and this affected both sides so fundamentally that nothing is less likely to have taken place than the gradual transformation of religious categories into secular concepts which the defenders of unbroken continuity try to establish. But she can tell us why the historians are able to spin it in this way. The reason why they can succeed lies in the nature of ideas in general, rather than in the period with which they deal. The moment one separates an idea entirely from its basis in real experience, it is not difficult to establish a connection between it and almost any other idea. The Platonic mode of thought and the inherent skepticism of the modern age make it easy to draw connections without a basis in evidence. This is unfortunately true in the sense that if your premises are not constrained in any way by the world of sensation, then literally any conclusion can come from a valid argument. So, to investigate if Arendt is wrong here, we would need to find evidence that the religious categories of the medieval age have in fact transformed into the secular categories of today, but we will not be looking for that here. Arendt's position is that secularization has not evolved from previous systems, it is simply the separation of church and state as a discrete political event. However, there is a very important sidebar in parentheses. It does not follow that this separation converted religion into an entirely private affair. This type of privacy in religion comes about only when a tyrannical regime prohibits the public functioning of churches. The public secular domain, or the political sphere, properly has room for the public religious sphere. A believer can be a public member of a church and at the same time act as a citizen in the larger unit constituted by all belonging to the city or the state. And personally, I think that makes it very clear that religion should always have a place in public life, but never in political life. In response to the separation, political theorists of the 17th century, such as Hobbes, who was ostensibly a believer, saw the purpose of the secular realm as a form of body politic that did not depend on any religious superstructure. This was assisted by the natural sciences, which seemed to be explaining more and more of nature. Secularization also caused the idea of any transcendent immortality, whether that be eternal life or resurrection, to be politically neutered. Once again, earthly continuity became the basis for meaning, and this led back to politics and ancient ideas of the body politic. Ancient civilizations would have valued the body politic itself as the machinery of remembrance, outside of which human life is not only nasty, brutish and short, but also ephemeral, leaving no trace behind it. That was the reason for the curse laid by Greek thinking on the whole sphere of private life, the idiocy of which consisted in its being concerned solely with survival. In other words, the secularization of the modern age once more brought to the fore that activity which Aristotle had called athanatizane. Recall that ancient greatness had a contempt for life because it aspired by itself to immortality. One outcome of this is that one cannot be great at all if one is concerned with life-sustaining needs. Therefore, the activity of athanatizane became relevant again in this new era which knows only earthly immortality. We are not as concerned with the thing which is immortal as much as we are with the process of becoming immortal. And what does that even mean in the modern age as Arendt understood it? And would any possible answer that she might have given still be plausible today? I smell a link with modern celebrity culture here, and this can be seen as Arendt continues that this striving for immortality often comes in at least three forms. First, immortalization through great deeds, immortal fame. Second, immortalization through contribution to the human artifice that is the world. And third, immortalization through spending of one's life with immortal things, the vita contemplativa. I'm leaving aside the biological example of procreation because that is not like nature, that is nature. But in the three other cases, it is an activity and it requires some space analogous to the being forever of nature in which immortalized things could reside. The danger that Arendt saw in the ancient institutions was that, with the passing of time, all polities eventually became unstable and destroyed the space which had been carved out for immortality. This was one reason for the third form of immortalization and why post-Socratic philosophers showed such apolitical tendencies. But they were not the only ones. The apoliticism of ancient philosophy foreshadowed the much more radical anti-political attitude of early Christianity, which, however, in its very extremism survived only so long as the Roman Empire provided a stable body politic for all nations and all religions. So, in its early centuries, like with philosophy, Christianity was happy to eschew the political realm because it was afforded a stable space in which to conduct its contemplations. However, the fall of Rome changed all of that and provided a useful narrative too. As far as Christian thought was concerned, this was a mere reaffirmation of its beliefs. To Christians, only individual men were immortal, but nothing else of this world, least of all the human artifice. Only by transcending this world could immortalizing activities be performed, and the only institution that could be justified within the secular realm was the Church, to which had fallen the burden of political responsibility. And so Christianity became a political force and appointed itself as the means by which human life could be immortalized, but not on earth. That this transformation of anti-political Christianity into a stable political institution was possible at all without complete perversion of the gospel is almost wholly due to Augustine, because he, still firmly rooted in the Roman tradition, could add to the Christian notion of an everlasting life the idea of a future civitas, a civitas Dei, where men, even in the hereafter, would continue to live in a community. Without this reformulation of Christian thoughts through Augustine, Christian politics might have remained what they had been in the early centuries, a contradiction in terms. Love that for two reasons. First, it seems to me that it exposes that the Church having temporal power of any kind obviously is a blatant perversion of the gospel, and accepting the burden of political responsibility is, at best, a well-intentioned rationalization. However, Arendt is more nuanced, and she pulls on the thread of community, saying that what Augustine did achieve in the Civitas Dei was to show that the idea of political life transcended the world and was thus not conceptually tainted with sin, quoting him that even the life of a saint is lived with other men. This is a genuinely lovely point, and it shows the absolutely essential connection for Arendt between the political realm and the plurality of humanity as a social species. Arendt is sometimes quite conservative, but I think she would absolutely agree with the idea that you live in a society is a common sense fact of modern life, and that the activity of sharing differing opinions would be sanctified even in Augustine's City of God. So again, we are told that the Roman Christian tradition is incompatible with the modern concept of history because it does not mesh well with modern perspectives on process in general and the time sequence in particular. Given that fact, the rise of the secular could be considered an inevitable consequence of modernity. But the rise of the secular also required the secularization of politics and required all humans to act under presupposed conditions of mortality, as discussed above. This is how immortalization again became important to humans in giving us a chance to transcend somehow. The naive solution, attempted by Nietzsche, is that we can just return to a concept of immortalizing praise from the Homeric model of history. But there is a problem. It did not allow humans in reality to mold their behavior in accordance with either the Greek or the Roman example. The ancient trust in the world being more permanent than individual men, and in political structures as a guarantee of earthly survival after death, did not return, so that the ancient opposition of a mortal life to a more or less immortal world failed them. Now both life and the world had become perishable, mortal, and futile.
That's existential.
The very fact that I'm able to make a joke like that underlines Arendt's next point. Today, we find it difficult to grasp that this situation of absolute mortality could be unbearable to men. Which I would say is not entirely true, but this idea of absolute mortality boils down to, essentially, most humans are functionally accustomed to their place as nominally insignificant complex animals in a single mortal body in a godless universe. Neither the Greek nor Roman Christian concepts of history can thus apply to us. But Arendt points out that our modern concept of history was born in the transitional period between the loss of this religious immortality and the new indifference to immortality in general. Returning to the concept of athanatizane, she states that immortalizing as an activity of mortal men can be meaningful only if there is no guarantee of life in the hereafter. Or should that be that there is a guarantee of no life in the hereafter? If there is no such guarantee, however, the activity of immortalizing becomes almost a necessity as long as there is any concern with immortality whatsoever. History, and especially secular history, is inextricably bound to the concept of immortality and remembrance, which are ultimately the only things that can immortalize the immortal life. Modern secular life has created a new version of this in the time sequence itself. History is the magnetic media tape of existence, winding from infinite spool to infinite spool over the recording head of now. And because each moment is strictly unique, earthly immortality is shared by all things. Arendt says that it is an advantage that this new model has made the idea of an endpoint almost inconceivable. I'm not sure that I agree that this is a wholly good thing, but its great disadvantage compared with ancient political theory seems to be that permanence is entrusted to a flowing process as distinguished from a stable structure. It encompasses the whole of mankind, whose history Hegel was consequently able to see as one interrupted development of the spirit. And yes, this passing of permanence is disturbing, dangerous, and something that is to be treated extremely carefully. But we are not talking in hypotheticals here. Pandora's box is open. History and the process of immortal fame have become ubiquitous, and only more so into the digital age. The very life of modern man is the analogue of the immortalizing praise of Homer. Modern humanity is no longer a purely biological species. We are a species that, by our very earthly presence, leaves ripples in the substratum of history. In the words of Droysen, who was perhaps the most thoughtful of the 19th century historians, what their species is for animals and plants, that is history for human beings. And again, Arendt finishes with a flourish and a strong claim. But is that really a fair analogy? I'll leave that for you to consider. On to the third part of the essay. In part 1, Arendt showed us the concept of history as it emerged in both the ancient and the modern world. In part 2, she explored the link between the concept of history and the concept of immortality, which underpins any meaning of history through time. Without immortality, any concept of history is futile. Ancient history used immortalizing fame to enable mortals to share in the eternity of nature. Medieval history promised the immortal life in the hereafter so that secular mortality was irrelevant. But in the modern age, confidence in the hereafter had gone, but immortalizing fame was not restored. We are left to decide what it is that gives meaning to life, and one of the few things that remains is the precession of time. Through Hegel, this became history and the historical consciousness and the spirit of God itself. However, while it is obvious that our historical consciousness would never have been possible without the rise of the secular realm to a new dignity, it was not so obvious that the historical process would eventually be called upon to bestow the necessary new meaning and significance upon men's deeds and sufferings on earth. According to Arendt, in the early modern period, many philosophers looked to the political realm for meaning. She mentions Locke and Hume, but primarily Hobbes, who tried to build a scientific structure for the political realm. The distinguishing trait of Hobbes' philosophy is his single-minded insistence upon the future and the resulting teleological interpretation of thought as well as of action. While all previous metaphysics had followed Aristotle in holding that inquiry into the first causes of everything is the chief task of philosophy, it was Hobbes' contention that, on the contrary, the task of philosophy was to guide purposes and aims and to establish a reasonable teleology of action. Aristotle and Hobbes, past and future, form and purpose? It can be said that Hegel's transformation of metaphysics into a philosophy of history was preceded by an attempt to get rid of metaphysics for the sake of a philosophy of politics. Hegel shifted the focus from politics to history. The question is, why did the concept of history come to replace the focus on political action? The forerunner of this was Vico again. Vico's masterwork is The New Science, which is another huge book I haven't read. For our purposes, Vico opposed the basis of Cartesian science, the building up of geometric structures from a priori principles, because all studies are understood in their human terms first, and so to suggest that these structures create some kind of great and eternal a priori structure is in fact a dangerous conceit. In effect, it seems like he is preempting the Arendt-Heisenberg dichotomy. The New Science is a grand project, but one place where Vico and Hegel are in accord is that the meaning of history can only be appreciated in hindsight, contemplatively, and as such it was a theoretical tool of appraisal. Politics cannot do this because it always occurs before the narrative has come to exist. Arendt will give more detail below, but apparently, where a genuine interest in political theory still survived, it ended in despair, as in Tocqueville, or in the confusion of politics with history, as in Marx. For what else but despair could have inspired Tocqueville's assertion that since the past has ceased to throw its light upon the future, the mind of man wanders in obscurity? And what else but confusion, a merciful confusion for Marx himself and a fatal one for his followers, could have led to Marx's identification of action with the making of history? This seems to be the tragedy of Marx as far as Arendt is concerned. He did what Vico and Hegel would never have considered, taking the political teleology of the early modern period and combining it with the concept of history to create an activity out of making history. Marx made that activity into the primary goal of philosophy, and Arendt simply does not agree with this goal, the turning of history into a fabrication in this way. Marx's political philosophy was based not upon an analysis of action, but on the Hegelian concern with history. It was the historian who was politicized. By the same token, the age-old identification of action with making and fabricating was supplemented through identifying the contemplative gaze of the historian with the contemplation of the model or pattern that guides the craftsman and precedes all making. Arendt says that in politicizing and objectifying the historical material, the danger was not in its utopian character, but that all the meaning of the past, all of the higher aims we might have, were turned into the willed intentions of future actions. When meaning is turned into an end, a certain point of reference is lost. But there is another problem with Marx's efforts, and it pertains to the idea of making, which is more akin to fabricating, i.e. constructing something that can be finished. The growing meaninglessness of the modern world is perhaps nowhere more clearly foreshadowed than in this identification of meaning and end. Meaning, which can never be the aim of action, and yet inevitably will rise out of human deeds after the action itself has come to an end, was now pursued with the same machinery of intentions and of organized means as were the particular direct aims of concrete action, with the result that it was as though meaning itself had departed from the world of men, and men were left with nothing but an unending chain of purposes in whose progress the meaningfulness of all past achievements was constantly cancelled out by future goals and intentions. It was as though men were suddenly stricken blind to fundamental distinctions such as the distinction between meaning and end, between the general and the particular, or, grammatically speaking, the distinction between for the sake of and in order to. As though the carpenter, for instance, forgot that only his particular acts in making a table are performed in the mode of in order to, but that his whole life as a carpenter is ruled by something quite different, namely an encompassing notion for the sake of which he became a carpenter in the first place. At the moment such distinctions are forgotten and meanings are degraded into ends, it follows that ends themselves are no longer safe because the distinction between means and ends is no longer understood, so that finally all ends turn and are degraded into means. So from that unabridged paragraph, the clear distinction I think think we are left with is that our human efforts are in order to achieve our ends, but they are for the sake of our deeper meaning. But all of these efforts are the means by way of which we satisfy both of these. When meaning and ends become conflated and no greater narrative is possible, it becomes hard to say if we are acting towards some goal or not. Arendt says that many pragmatic philosophers, not only Marx, tried to cast the human sphere of action in terms of this process of making or fabrication, but only Marx took the final step that if human politics is being made, then it can also be finished. She cautions us that whenever we hear about grandiose claims in politics, then this is the kind of thinking that is in play. The inconsistency that exposes Marx's error, politicizing not action but history, is that if history as a fabrication has an end, then it must also have a beginning, and this is inconsistent with the twofold infinity of the time sequence upon which the modern concept of history is based in the first place. Secondly, there is something weird in the idea of all of history, all of it, being merely for the purpose of those who come at the end and get to live in the finished house, so to speak. And finally, there is the danger that people will start to believe that the process truly is predictable and that they have identified the fundamental moving parts, like class struggle for instance, without proper justification. It is thus unwise to think in terms of making history. This process is incapable of guaranteeing men any kind of immortality because its end cancels out and makes unimportant whatever went before. In the classless society, the best mankind can do with history is to forget the whole unhappy affair, whose only purpose was to abolish itself. So I have a question. I don't think Arendt ever says it explicitly in Between Past and Future, but is she actually saying that Marx did not raise up labour and he did not redefine political action, but instead he simply turned history into a fabrication, a product? And is she also saying that by doing this he robbed history of any possible meaning and purpose it has, because products, strictly speaking, cannot have any purpose until they have been produced? Arendt shifts gears now, speaking of the same meaninglessness in terms of strictly utilitarian philosophies, including those of Marx. These are ones that have a clearly defined standard for judging the desirability of future outcomes. The critique of utilitarianism is always that its standard always reduces to some nebulous concept of the good or happiness, which winds up being very circular. The Euthyphro dilemma has never really been solved. Every attained end is changed immediately into the means to a new end, thereby, as it were, destroying meaning wherever it is applied. In the midst of the seemingly unending progress, one question arises that no utilitarian thinking can ever answer. And what is the use of use? Marx missed this and was not the last to do so, because he thought that he had finally broken the cycle and discovered a bona fide prime mover of law of history, the class struggle. In all such attempts, what is considered to be meaning is in fact no more than a pattern, and within the limitations of utilitarian thought, nothing but patterns can make sense, because only patterns can be made, whereas meanings cannot be, but, like truth, will only disclose or reveal themselves. The critique of utilitarianism is a fair one, but the response sounds something like a religious doctrine. Meaning, like truth, must be a revelation. However, Arendt is always more nuanced than this, and I would like to use this idea for my own little sidebar into the present day as I see it. It is not controversial to say that there are a number of spheres of human experience where competing ideologies are becoming disruptive. And while not all of those call themselves utilitarian, they are all aimed at something that utilitarianism would value, i.e. happiness or goodness. And they all have their revelatory aspects, of course. But the only time those revelations are referenced is in explicitly personal anecdotes. Everyone, from the religious believer to the gender abolitionist to the devoted scholar to the most depraved criminal to the most mundane person in the entire world, has a worldview that has, in their mind at least, been revealed to them and that they cannot prove. And no, your book does not count. This does resemble the relativistic postmodern morass that deontologists are so afraid of, and I grant you, it is terrifying, but look around you. We are in it. That much is patently obvious, but we should not be paralysed by that realisation. That's what these exercises in thought represent, and I think it applies to Arendt more broadly, a possible method, a pattern if you will, to create meaning out of the fact that we are all here, a plurality. It will always be dangerous if, like Marx, we decide that we, and only we, have discovered the revelation. But how do we actually create anything when we have seen historians freely imposing upon the maze of past facts almost any pattern they wish, with the result that the ruin of the factual and particular through the seemingly higher validity of general meanings has even undermined the basic factual structure of all historical process, that is, chronology? And Arendt's not really an answer to that question is the rest of the book. Arendt says that Marx was the last thinker to concern themselves with politics rather than history, and she builds on the idea from earlier by identifying the moment where this shift of philosophical momentum from politics to history occurred. Philosophy abandoned politics, she says, with the failure of the French revolutionary calendar. It was as though it was conceded that not even the revolution contained sufficient independent meaning in itself to begin a new historical process, and this was a repudiation of the Roman faith in the sacredness of foundations with the accompanying custom of numbering time from the foundation date. This was one aspect of the crossover from a philosophy of politics to a philosophy of history, but another is found in Kant, who Arendt says also struggled with the concept of history. He complained about the melancholy haphazardness of contingency and wanted to depend on the truth that history as a whole has meaning, because there is always at least a story to be told. Arendt says that Kant, like Vico before and Hegel after him, was aware of something, an intent, nature, spirit, whatever, that was somehow guiding that process. This thing is what defines or constitutes the meaning. The modern concept of history proved to be very useful in giving the secular political realm a meaning which it otherwise seemed to be devoid of. In Kant, in contrast to Hegel, the motive for the modern escape from politics into history is still quite clear. It is the escape into the whole, and the escape is promoted by the meaninglessness of the particular. However, Kant was in no way enthusiastic about the concept of history. The bewildered regret and great diffidence with which Kant resigned himself to introducing a concept of history into his political philosophy indicates with rare precision the nature of the perplexities which caused the modern age to shift its emphasis from a theory of politics, apparently so much more appropriate to its belief in the superiority of action, to an essentially contemplative philosophy of history. This is a value-laden statement claiming rare precision, so I leave it to a scholar of Kant to determine if Arendt is truly correct. Kant was focused on pragmatic questions of what we should do, so he was simply not concerned with the distinction between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa at all. Instead, Kant focused on the hierarchy within the vita activa, which Arendt says is hidden and rarely articulated. This is the very hierarchy that she would articulate through her later work, and this is a good time to bring back the schematic of the vita activa, at least as I understand it. Again, credit to Arendt, blame to me, and so on. The three realms of Arendt's vita activa begin with labour, the lowest realm, I think, because it is fundamentally the closest to the naturalistic grounding of life and the life process. Here we also find ideas of cultivation, which is the outcome of labour, and this extends up into the realm of work, where it becomes something more like maybe ingenuity? Spanning over this boundary is bread and circuses, the space of a nascent culture as labouring humans developed, or maybe required, something to fill their vacant time. Eventually, fabrications create the world and develop it to the point where some people become free of subsistence need. This is society in various forms, stretching from the realm of work up into the realm of action, and contained within society and the realm of action is the public space where humans disclose their authentic selves. But this space and society itself is driven by the energy which comes up from that lower realm of vitality in the activities of art and rhetoric, which eventually become the products of art and politics. But they must pass through the realm of fabrication to get there. And now we approach the paradox. Through proper taste and judgment, we are able to identify that which is most beautiful, and the greatest expressions of human culture will attach to that which ties back, or relegare. This is the conduit by which the realm of action is linked back to life and the realm of labour, without the violating intermediary of fabrication. To me, the realm of work represents yang, control, and that which ties back represents yin, surrender. The final main features of this schematic are mass culture and mass society, by which artifacts of culture are drawn back down to the life process and dissolved into it. Arendt called this a degradation, but I wonder if it is just an inevitable part of cultural churn. The dynamics between these levels are very important in Arendt's philosophy, but traditional philosophy often pays only lip service to the estimate of action as the highest activity of man, preferring the so much more reliable activity of making, so that the hierarchy within the vita activa has hardly ever been fully articulated. But Kant was all over that shit, and he saw that action fulfilled neither of the two hopes the modern age was bound to expect from it. If secularization implies the desire for some kind of earthly immortality, then, from the point of view of motivation, action appears to be the least interesting and most futile of all human pursuits, being the most ephemeral thing, primarily born of passions and contingent events. From the point of view of achievement, then, action appears at once to be more futile and more frustrating than the activities of labouring and of producing objects, of work, being the most ephemeral things, with no permanence at all without the additional energy of remembrance. And furthermore, human action almost never fulfills its original intention. No act can ever be irrefutably recognised by its author. Whoever begins to act must know that he has started something whose end he can never foretell. His deed has already changed everything and made it even more unpredictable. This is Kant's melancholy haphazardness. Arendt says that the process of history, with its similarity to action, could, at least for a while, provide meaning to the political sphere. Process is the direct effect of any action and intimately connected with science, both natural and historical. Secularization allowed action to inherit this meaning for the first time since the Platonic crisis. History, in its modern version, could come to terms with this experience of action, and though it failed to save politics itself from the old disgrace, though the single deeds and acts constituting the realm of politics, properly speaking, were left in limbo, it has at least bestowed upon the record of past events that share of earthly immortality to which the modern age necessarily aspired, but which its acting men no longer dared to claim from posterity. End of part 3. And we're not quite done, but before we get into Arendt's conclusion, look, you've seen everything that's gone before, and let me reiterate, I have no special authority to simplify the concept of history as I understand it. Nonetheless, here goes. Ancient history was based on an immortal concept of nature and a mortal concept of humanity. Post-Platonic and into medieval history came to treat ideas and the human soul as immortal, and therefore it was nature and the world that became mortal. Into the modern age, and for all the reasons we discussed above, humans, humanity, their ideas, the world, and even nature itself is now de facto mortal, and immortality is now only to be found in the process, and the crisis of modernity is coming to terms with that. The loss of meaning is because we do not know how to draw meaning from this new source of immortality. This leads us on to the final line. Although there is still no absolute meaning and no realistic prospect of it, the modern concept of history has at least provided some record into which deeds can be written, even if the content can be fabricated rather than just remembered. And what does it mean to say that acting men no longer dared to claim earthly immortality from posterity? Is it that we don't dare, i.e. cowardice, or is it that we lack daring, simply apathy? And how would we even claim it anyway? This is the only essay in Between Past and Future where Arendt herself names the individual parts, and though several other essays have a paragraph break quite near to the end, this is the only true epilogue in the book. You can decide for yourself whether that is significant, but for the purposes of my narrative, the content of this final few pages is illustrative of many of the problems we've seen in this interwoven collection of thought exercises. Today, the Kantian and Hegelian way of becoming reconciled to reality through understanding the innermost meaning of the entire historical process seems to be quite as much refuted by our experience as the simultaneous attempt of pragmatism and utilitarianism to make history and impose upon reality the preconceived meaning and law of man. This is the crisis of modernity writ large in history. Neither looking forward nor back seems to provide meaning. We are left to review our axioms of thought in hope that a new way emerges. We know that these axioms will certainly be part of some consistent system, but they will never be the system. This is the basis of postmodernism as a premise. We must go beyond the attachment to any one system as sacrosanct. However, it does not follow that these systems should be destroyed. Indeed, Arendt maintains that these systems remain important in a different way, which is much closer to what is now called metamodernism. Ugh, technical terms. Reframing this in terms of Heisenberg-Arendt, we now find that even the scientist encounters nothing but himself, meaning that every data point is now received through man-made constructions and patterns. In some sense, it has always been this way. The gap has always been there. But now Arendt implies again that this includes the natural sciences, and she will resolve that point here. Before we go there, we should concede that those in the humanities sometimes take a rather cavalier approach when pontificating on the abstract conceptual expressions of the latest scientific discoveries. This is acknowledged, and I understand why this rubs scientists the wrong way. But the purpose is analogy, and yes, many analogies are wrong, but Arendt's are quite well developed, and the only way to know for sure is to play with them. Arendt says that this modern subjectivity and its meaningless could be relatively harmless if it were the case that this is simply the difference in perspective of people around a table. The table itself can remain the same, but just the difference of people's perspectives that change. But it's not like that. We can now make any question at all lead to a consistent set of answers. What is really undermining the whole modern notion that meaning is contained in the process as a whole is that we can take almost any hypothesis and act upon it with a sequence of results in reality which not only make sense, but work. This means quite literally that everything is possible, not only in the realm of ideas, but in the field of reality itself. The political conclusion emerges from her previous work on totalitarianism. I think it's fair to mention here that Arendt had several deeply personal connections to the context of totalitarianism in the 20th century. She experienced life as a German Jew in the 1930s, and she was detained on at least one occasion. She escaped the country and helped provide safe passage to other Jews fleeing around that time. And she was also a student of, and had a brief affair with, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who went on to become a staunch member of the Nazi Party. But here's the thing. Depending on how we choose to interpret them, all of those facts could sway us either way in assessing the objectivity of her case. Does she have a uniquely nuanced perspective or a deep conflict of interests? Or both? This is, of course, precisely her point. How do we establish any objectivity at all in the political realm? Totalitarian systems tend to demonstrate that action can be based on any hypothesis, and that, in the course of consistently guided action, the particular hypothesis will become true factual reality. The assumption which underlies consistent action can be as mad as it pleases. It will always end in producing facts which are then objectively true. The axiom from which the deduction is started does not need to be, as traditional metaphysics and logic supposed, a self-evident truth. Arendt tells us that this frightening arbitrariness, as opposed to a melancholy haphazardness, is clear in the political realm, but it is sometimes missed in the historical realm. Historians like to believe that they are capturing history in an objective process, but there is always something that is not captured in any narrative. And now Arendt triggers the natural scientists once again. Within the natural sciences, things are not essentially different. Here too, thinking in terms of processes on the one hand, and the conviction on the other that I know only what I myself have made, has led to the complete meaninglessness inevitably resulting from the insight that I can choose to do whatever I want, and some kind of meaning will always be the consequence. And so yes, Arendt does absolutely impose the same model on the natural sciences and the humanities in the context of the greater stature of man as discussed in Essay 8. It is only in the context of a larger something, a process or a tradition, that meaning emerges at all. And that thing is necessarily larger than any human system, and thus we can never comprehensively analyse it. To say nothing of the fact that, often for political reasons, not all scientific truths are actually discovered. In fact, science as an analytic technique is sometimes hostile to meaning. Every event is part of some process, but any process can lead to any meaning. The modern world has brought us to a place where no one system, be it a process or a tradition, can provide the meaning we look for because, of course, your system is consistent from its axioms. With enough work, they all are. It is as though the melancholy haphazardness of the particular had now caught up with us and were pursuing us into the very region where the generations before us had fled in order to escape it. The melancholy haphazardness of the particular can be defined in just one word: contingency. Contingency was discussed in Truth and Politics. The brute nature of the human world is that factual truths have no clear reason at all for being the way they are, which is why the concept of history will always be associated with the problem of political narratives. As a final side note, while talking in terms of a crisis is evocative and not entirely unreasonable in our circumstances, we should remember that in the preface, Arendt suggested that there has always been this gap between past and future, and a crisis existing there. It's just that the modern world has made this crisis existential in more ways than one. So what possible direction are we left with? Ironically, it is really only those things that exist in the world of common sense, the world that everyone can see. The decisive factor in this experience, both in nature and in history, is not the patterns with which we try to explain, but that our technology, which obviously works, is based on these principles, and that our social techniques, whose real field of experimentation lies in the totalitarian countries, have only to overcome a certain time lag to be able to do for the world of human relations and human affairs as much as has already been done for the world of human artifacts. So finally, the scientist should be mollified. It is our technology, the practical product of the scientific process, that demonstrates that there is meaning in that process. Unfortunately, the understanding of the whole cannot be seen in the particular, and so science itself as an institution does not benefit from the meaning produced in its fabrications. And this is why the scientist must still suffer in doubt along with the humanist and the clergyman. But more concerning is that final clause which I have italicised, almost thrown in as an afterthought. It's a strong and concerning claim, but Arendt was among the most qualified people to be able to make it, and if we look at the realm of propaganda and advertising, that's just one realm, mind you, then clearly there is always a political effort to remove unpredictability from the population. But is this truly political action, or is it fabrication, the violence of the craftsman? The modern age, with its growing world alienation, has led to a situation where man, wherever he goes, encounters only himself. All the processes of the earth and the universe have revealed themselves either as man-made or as potentially man-made. These processes, after having devoured the solid objectivity of the given, ended by rendering meaningless the one overall process which was originally conceived to give meaning to them and to act, so to speak, as an eternal time-space into which they could all flow and thus be rid of their mutual conflicts and exclusiveness. This is what happened to our concept of history as it happened to our concept of nature. In the situation of radical world alienation, neither history nor nature is at all conceivable. This twofold loss of the world, the loss of nature and the loss of human artifice in the widest sense, which would include all of history, has left behind it a society of men who, without a common world which would at once relate and separate them, either live in desperate lonely separation or are pressed together into a mass. For a mass society is nothing more than that kind of organised living which automatically establishes itself among human beings who are still related to one another but have lost the world once common to all of them. World alienation is the threat. And again, we get this framing of man encountering only himself as the essence of Cartesian doubt, which is only enhanced by the experiences and discoveries of the modern world. Arendt's unwieldy but accurate term, the loss of confidence in the truth-revealing capacity of the senses, leads to this loss of meaning. Arendt broadly sides with Vico and Kant that there must be something that we look back upon to allow us to reflect in order to have any meaning at all. However, she also sees that changes are coming in the modern world and that many pertinent ideas were introduced by Marx, Nietzsche or other divisive postmodern thinkers. But despite this, she warns of the profound dangers of reducing everything to a process, and so I guess that she remains a centrist overall. But there is a contradictory tone at the end there. Without a common world that would relate and separate them, men live separately or as part of a mass. It seems that either way we are either together or apart. So great, that helps a lot. In the context of this essay though, let me speculate that a common world is a single consistent concept of the way of things, which was never really a thing but has now been shown to be completely incoherent. This apparent common world used to bind people together into a polity while separating them into their respective roles and perspectives. Without the common world, there are those who create their own narratives, they create their own stories, and there are those that follow the currents of history that are shown in the narratives and the way they are recorded in the concept of history itself. Arendt's descriptions of desperate loneliness or being pressed together into a mass are evocative and not necessarily hyperbolic. She has explained world alienation quite comprehensively at this point. However, she has, as ever, left the puzzle incomplete, but only because she knew that there are always more pieces to come out of the box. You probably knew this was coming, but I want to bring in Taoism again at the end here, although in passing we should note that in the Confucian school, actual Chinese historiography followed something that was more similar to the Roman Christian mode of propagation than anything else. I mentioned earlier that the modern shift from objects to processes is only modern in the Western world. Focusing on Taoism though, Roger Amy's and David Hall's philosophical translation of the Tao Te Ching talks about the idea of Taoist cosmology and says that it is almost a contradiction in terms to talk of a Taoist cosmos. In Chinese, one of the words for cosmos is the 10,000 things, indicating that the idea of the whole as a singularity is somehow strange. If the world is truly process, or at least is to be interpreted that way, then the process is always in progress, and there truly are no nouns, only verbs. The real purpose of philosophy then, superseding the methodological quarrels that Arendt spoke of, is to indicate a way for embodied humans to accept the idea that, to quote Derren Brown, maybe there is no self, maybe we just selve. I want to finish with Amos and Hall's translation of the title of the Tao Te Ching, which they observe is something that translators often avoid doing. They suggest 3 possible translations of the title, each one putting a different emphasis on the aspect of the piece. The classic of this focus and its field emphasizes a cosmological insight. Feeling at home in the world leans towards existential insight, but Amos and Hall themselves opt for the 3rd translation, making this life significant, which highlights the teleological insight that enables us to just selve. Bye for now.